Live here on a Tuesday. So welcome everyone. This is all going to be about data-driven recruiting. How do you strategically utilize and leverage it? I feel like the word data recruiting has just been all up in our faces, probably for like the last 5 years, but sometimes you're like, what is data? What am I supposed to use? What do I talk about? How do I feel more powerful? And then even more so, at what level am I supposed to use data in my recruiting? I think is also an interesting topic. So super happy to be live here on LinkedIn. Please put in the chat. So we do these. I know that, we have Amy and Brittany, and I'll introduce them in a second, but we do these because we want to give back to the recruiting community. We want to talk about our battle scars. We want to talk about all the things we've learned. So connect here. Networking is super, super important. And ask all the questions in the world. These two women have scaled companies to mega lengths. And so we're going to get into that. But first, welcome. I'm Brianna Rooney, a millionaire recruiter from Talent Perch Diversity. And actually who's putting this on is one of my most favorite companies. I've used them for, I think, like 2.5 years at this point, and this is Covey. So Covey is essentially allows humans to do what they do best by letting intelligent machines do all the work that we probably don't want to do. They have a new product, which is Covey Scout, and it is the world's most advanced AI sourcing assistant trained to find and evaluate talent just like you would. So for me, I'm a sourcer by nature, by heart, but yet I talk to Scout and I tell them exactly how to do it the way I want to do it. And it's pretty freaking awesome. If you have not used it, definitely try it. But let's get to our guest. So we have Brittany Mitlo, who is Duolingo's Director of University Recruiting. She scaled the company from 70 to over 700 employees. And each year her team hires and supports 100 university hires, which is so many. Welcome, Brittany. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me, Brianna.
Nice. And now we have Amy Silverman, who is the Director of Recruiting at Chime. She joined when they were just under 200. I think only employee number 2 in Chicago. And now they have 1,300. But she also scaled Groupon when they were just under 200 as well to 14,000. So it's safe to say that growing teams has been a bulk of her career and a huge passion of hers. Welcome, Amy.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Okay. Two wonderful women in this room. So first and foremost, I guess let's just open it up to, at what stage in your career did you first start paying attention to data? Brittany, I'll go to you first, but when did data become important? Do we feel like it was just a trend? Did you lift up your heads maybe when you were in leadership? Like, when did that come?
Yeah, I mean, through all parts of my career, it's been important. Speaking specifically at Duolingo, data had been important because of the type of company I was in, a very eng-led focused org. And I came in new to the tech world whenever I joined Duolingo, and was like, my eyes were even open further, just how much we could measure. So I think being around that environment really spurs everyone else in this environment, including people in the TA team, to really think about data at a high level, but also on a very small level. Like, you would be amazed at what we pay attention to. And like, even just one data point can sort of drive decisions one way or another. So it's been since the beginning, but it's evolved, which I'm sure Amy and I will both talk about.
Yeah. Oh, I can't wait to hear. So think about that. Actually put in the chat of like, what's the smallest data point that like really affected something massive? Like, that's what I want to know. We'll dig in there. Because I'm thinking about a couple of things internally with me, but okay. Amy, what about you? When did you start paying attention? How'd you handle it?
Yeah, for sure. I think whenever you start your career, you start to realize that you're more reputable if you walk into a room talking with data versus feelings. I think, Brianna, you and I have talked about this in a podcast before around how, it holds more weight to say, hey, look at the numbers versus, hey, I feel like the pipeline might not be building or growing the way that it should be. And so I think very early on in my recruiting career, I realized that there's power in data. And I think that's only expanded, obviously, as I've gone into leadership roles and had teams and things like that, just really making sure that we understand what our numbers are so that we can have productive conversations with the business and really be successful at the end of the day, because recruiting is a partnership function, not a service function. And so really making sure that we have that partnership, I think, is really crucial.
That got me so excited because I think that's what got us a seat at the table. It's kind of crazy that it only took data to do that, because really hiring is the most important function, a company does. But when you talk about relating it to the business side, I think that's when everyone's like, oh, okay. I mean, I know I've had hiring managers sit in a room with me and say, okay, great. We need to hire 20 people in 60 days. I go, okay, great. So does your team have time for that? And they were like, what do you mean? Does my team have time for that? Can your team handle that? I'm like, okay, let's work backwards. Let's see how many interviews this needs and, how many resumes you're going through, stuff like that. So I love all of that. Now, let's talk about the recent years, though. Like, how has it really impacted us as we talk about getting a seat at the table? So, Amy, let me start with you. What shifts have you seen just in the last 4 years, for that matter?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of shifts for many reasons. First of all, obviously tooling is much more advanced than it was, 4 or 5 years ago or more around what we can do with data and what we can track. Even in ATS reports, you can track a lot more now than you used to be able to before. So I think that's really helped us be able to evolve. I think also we have a much better understanding, or maybe this is just I have a much better understanding of sort of what is needed when it comes to the output in order to get to the goal. And so really, like, Brianna, you mentioned this idea of working backwards. We think about that a lot. How do we take the goal and work backwards? And then how do we educate the business around what that looks like and what we're going to need from them and what roadblocks we might be seeing based on what data we're seeing come in. So there's just been a lot of advancements around data storytelling. And I think that's what it comes down to, because you can put a bunch of numbers on the screen or on, you can say them in a meeting, but if you're not telling the story or the narrative behind the data, I think that's a big miss, and you're not going to be getting as compelling of results as you would if you put the story behind it.
Okay, so did you train yourself to put a story behind the data? Did someone else train you? How'd you do that?
Yeah, I think just over the course of time, you kind of realize the effectiveness of it. And I kind of put myself in someone else's shoes, right? Like, I'm not an engineer and I'm not a product person and I'm not analyst or whatever. And so if someone was going to present their information to me and just say, hey, here's the, this, and this, I'd be really confused. But if they're able to tell me a story, it's like going back to being a kid again. You can listen to a story, you can understand a story, and you can get buy-in that way. And so for me, I think that's really important, is what is the story that you're telling and how does the data sort of support that and help you to achieve that goal?
Yeah. So think about like younger in their careers, recruiters. How do they start to tell that story? Like, would you role play that with them in order to have hard meetings and conversations with hiring managers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's all about just understanding basic metrics. So think, what is your conversion rate from recruiter phone screen to hiring manager screen? If your number is really low, let's say you're doing way too many screens, then you're moving forward. Well, then maybe you don't have a great understanding of the profile. Maybe there's some calibration that needs to happen there. The next phase of that is, what's the pass-through rate from hiring manager screen to round one or whatever your next stage in your process is? Again, if we're seeing a low conversion rate there, then that tells me that there might be disconnect, and it might not be a recruiter disconnect. It might be a hiring manager disconnect. So it's really learning how to ask questions. I think as I continue on in my career, one of the biggest things that I've learned is that asking probing questions is the absolute best thing that you can do versus telling somebody, because when you're asking them questions, you're getting them to actually tell you. And so for me, I think asking questions is key.
Power of the question. So, Brittany, what would you say is maybe like the top 3 questions that you would ask in order to gauge that?
Yeah, Amy was actually tickling a lot of things in my brain.
I figured we're vibing on it.
I'm like, yes. So actually a few years ago at our talent acquisition offsite that we host, we do like 2 a year for the TA team. We'll have people on the team do presentations, interactive sessions, really look in-house at our experts to teach the team certain things. for me, I'm a naturally curious person. And like early in my days here at Duolingo, I was like always asking why, even if it was like, you're recruiter one, you just started, why are you asking so many whys? But that was sort of also like embedded, like it really was encouraged at the same time where it's like, okay, maybe don't ask why right now. We'll ask why later. But so for me with the team at this offsite is I did a whole presentation on like getting to the why behind things. And actually, whenever you're talking about being like childlike in things, I said at one point, whenever I was doing the interactive piece, I'm going to be acting like your annoying little sister. I'm going to keep asking you why. Why? Like, well, the offer accept rate is this. I'm like, why? Well, because people aren't accepting. Why? Well, because of compensation. Why? Like, keep getting that piece. But I think when you look at it at a really high level, when you're like coaching your team on how to do this, it is doing it in the moment, right? Of like, if I get a message of like, whatever question it is, I will keep asking why. And then they like realize what game I'm playing with them. But it's like doing that, but then also coaching at the high level of like we do retrospectives for all of our roles. Every time, it's like a couple of roles close or we end a university recruiting season, we'll do these like really high in-depth, like multi-page retros that we share with executive leadership that they look forward to every time that it's, retrospective time. And every piece of it is the recruiter digging into the why for specific pieces. So, and it's like aligning to what leadership's goals are, to what your own goals are as a recruiting team, and then finding that in between as well, right? Of telling that story, because that's how you can tell the most compelling stories if you know the why and you can bring that high level data, that singular piece of data into that story you're telling.
I love that. So I think back to like earlier days when I first started recruiting and like I was just going off of a job description, right? And you talk to the hiring manager a little bit, but it's like you're just trying to get this one person to fit this one job description. Like that's how it was, right? And then we learned more, right? Wait, why are you hiring this person? Why do we need this? I think if we could all, as I think in an industry, right, always ask that why, perhaps layoffs wouldn't be so much. Because then we can actually say, why do we need this person? What is this person going to do here? What product are they, what problem are they solving? Do we have anyone internally that can do this? Like there's just so many questions that I think, I don't know if don't have the time to ask, we're scared to ask. Brittany, what are your thoughts there as far as like asking those questions? Because I'm thinking like, oh God, I love to explain things. Like, let's really walk through this. Let's really dig. Like, that's fun for me. But I know that there's lots of, hiring managers who are like, look, I'm supposed to not build this team with you, but I need to build out a product or I have this deadline. And so they're very like crunched on time. How do you do that and make it be super effective?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is aligning consistently with your leaders above you, even, right? So myself now as leading the university team, I'm aligning with head of TA, with our CPO, who's aligning with finance. Like it's putting yourselves, keeping those conversations consistent and relevant, and making sure that you understand your business's goals too, like not operating in a vacuum. If the org wants to scale to X because of XYZ product, or if we don't even know we want to scale to yet, but we know that these products are coming down the line, or these teams really are going to need a lot more people in them. It's making sure that you are, again, like not operating in a silo, in a vacuum is super important. And then as a leader, especially think it like a company that's still like growing a lot and figuring out like what that communication is up and down. Again, it is being like the annoying little sister in the room of asking the why and then giving the context as to why you're asking the why as well, right? So that they don't have to ask you why in return. You're saying, this very short TLDR of like, here's why I'm asking. Like, can you just give me a little bit more information? And sometimes you'll get I can't give you that answer right now, or let's talk about it later, or actually there's this very confidential thing. But like, you just have to do your due diligence, especially if you're in a leadership position, because you're, responsible for all these other people, right? For their output, for their, ability to forecast. So yeah, it's just asking the why, but then giving that context too.
Of why you're doing it. Cause I know like, well, I've got 2 little kids, so they're always asking me why. So I'm very much vibing on that. And then now, because I'm used to always giving a why, that if I don't get a why, I'm like upset. So like even just like with my adult relationships, right? I'm like, well, no, wait, why are we talking about this? Why is this a thing? Why are we, it's always like, kind of like, why are you wasting my time? Right? We've got all these things to do. Now I'm thinking about the certain data that really moves the needle So let's talk about 3 different ones. Cause like, obviously there's, I mean, in a perfect world, we have like what, 20 different sets of data that we can go by. But what are 3 that we're like, we need to know these 3 points to make a decision? Amy, let's start with you.
Yeah, and actually, before I jump into that, I just want to
Yeah.
add a cherry on top of what we were talking about before. I also think something that's really important and can get lost is alignment as a people function or HR function, whatever your company might call it. It can be easy to think like, I work in TA, I work in talent acquisition or recruiting, and so people partner function or business partner function, not important to me. That's actually really false. That is your partner in crime. That's someone that you should be partnering really closely with. And obviously this is assuming the company you're working with is skilled to have a HR or people function. It's different if, that doesn't exist. But if it does exist, your job should be to be in lockstep with that person, because you both can go to the business and have conversations as a united team and be able to help kind of move things along that way. So that was just kind of my one add on that, is I think sometimes things can kind of get lost in that. And it's really important to have a united HR and people function.
So that's a really great tip. And I would love to know the audience if anyone has that. Like, does anyone have because we tend to separate, like first HR recruiting was in HR. Then we're like, oh, we're separate functions. But I love how you're like, actually, we have to work together. This is always a partnership, and that's your ally. That's like your road dog.
Yeah,
I love
100%, 100%. Okay, now I'll go back to your question.
Yeah,
Sorry, I skirted this way. So 3 pieces of data that I think are most important. It's a tough question, because I think there's a case to be made that the whole picture is more important than just one data point sometimes, because there can be, as we said, like the reasons why behind those things. But it depends on what we're trying to solve for. So, if we're trying to solve for speed, are we trying to solve for candidate quality? What is it that we're sort of trying to solve for? And also, are we working on a pipeline, or are we working on an individual role? I think that's going to be very important to understand as well, because if you're working on a one-off role, the numbers are going to be much smaller. Your recruiters should be having less conversations and should be able to kind of hone things in. If you're working on a large pipeline of engineers or product managers or analysts, those numbers are going to be pretty large. And so understanding how to kind of scale those is really important. So I guess my answer is it depends. But I think there's a bunch of different really interesting metrics that you can look at. I think a big topic, and maybe we'll get to this later, is around like DEI and around, diversity and inclusion. And even numbers around that, I think sometimes get conflated. Folks say, well, we need to have, X percentage of the pipeline be diverse. And I think that's really important. But I think the more important metric that we should be looking at in that case is, what is the population of the team that we're working to fill right now? And, where are the gaps from a skill set perspective and from, a mindset and background perspective? And how do we sort of strategically fill those gaps? To me, that's the most important thing, because you want to have a holistic understanding of that team versus just saying we need top of funnel 30% diverse. That might be effective, but it might not actually help you achieve the goal for that specific team. So that's my kind of answer, and I'm happy to dig into anything else, but I think it's really dependent on what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I would agree with that. What are we solving for? I feel like that's a question I'm now reverted into, in addition to why. It's what are we solving for? So it's that piece. Is there something bigger or deeper we need to look at, right? If it's offer accept rate of women identifying candidates, like, is there something else bigger that we need to look at as an example? And then also, how important is it? Like, and that segues into like, what resources can we put into it? Whether it's just like recruiter time, if it's money, if it's additional tools. Like, I think, the figuring out the what is it, like, what are we solving for? And then how important is it something bigger that we need to like, take an even larger view at?
Yeah, it's figuring out like, what's the problem? It's always like, what are we solving? What's the problem? Amy, I love that you said each team. And of course, like DEI has to be super, super top of mind, right? And I'm always, well, I shouldn't say I'm always told the 30%. That seems like a very common, okay, all your outreach needs to be 30%. We have to have maybe the Rooney rule, like every third, person has to be diverse, stuff like that. But what I really got from that is each team should have different metrics.
100%.
So I want to talk through that, because like I'll talk to someone and they'll be like, oh, great, our offer acceptance rate is 92%. And I do eng, right? So I do engineering. I'm like, God, that's really high for engineering. And they're like, oh no, that's our entire org. I'm like, what are we talking? I'm not talking about your entire org. It like gets me really like frustrated when companies group it all in one thing. So it's like, I wonder, my question is, why are we grouping it and not doing it individually in each team? Is it because a higher stat looks better? Is it because maybe we're not thinking about each team? Like, and there's probably no actual answer to this, but like,
yeah, I don't know. I think people probably have their own, perceptions, but I think probably it's easier for folks to kind of have a one size fits all approach, because then there's like a constant rule that folks can kind of go to. Again, not to compare everybody to children, but we're all just big children, I suppose. Everybody likes a rule. And so if you can point to the rule and say, hey, do this is the rule, people are like, okay, cool, I'll do that rule. But there's a lot more nuance to it. And so I think it really is just understanding, what that nuance is. And when you're talking about DEI, there are other things to think about too. Diversity of thought is just as important as, ethnic background as well. I think it's really important to think about, what population is your company trying to serve? And I think I mentioned this in our last session as well. Like, do your insides as a company match your outsides? Like, does the population that works for you match the population that you're working for as a product or a business? And to me, I think that's really important, because you want to make sure that you have people that are going to understand your market, that are going to understand the people that you're working to serve from a product perspective. So definitely something that's really, really important for us, and something that's always top of mind, and we're trying to be really thoughtful of as we kind of approach each search.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Brittany, so you serve the university side in particular, right?
Yep.
So do you like all sit down on all the different like teams and stuff and say, hey, here's our numbers, and be like, hey, actually product, you have better numbers as us. Can we walk through this? Or are you guys kind of siloed?
Yeah, I mean, our team, the university team itself, is quite cohesive. So we have recruiters that focus on design, product, and et cetera. So I think more for us, it's aligning with the industry team. That is where we can sometimes get siloed, because university and industry feel like completely different beasts. University is on an academic calendar. For us, it's less about quarterly signs and more like throughout the whole season. How are we tracking compared to previous years, to other competitors in the market? So for us, it's like we know that our industry side of the house has a higher general offer accept rate than university. But one of the things too of like comparing seemingly with sometimes what can feel like apples to oranges is, again, as professionals, especially for leaders, it's how do we tell the story of like, here's what this means for university, here's what this means for industry, here's why it's different, here's why it's similar, and explaining it to our larger audience, right? Senior leadership, executives, anyone else involved in the hiring process. And it's like, yeah, sometimes it can get, I know, frustrating being of like, here's like this general offer accept rate or this general XYZ data point. But it's like, how do we explain it and make it as simple for people who are not ingrained in TA, right? Like we can start to talk about like a lot of like lingo and get people lost in like specific things, and talk about even like in the university space, I'll talk about conversion and eligible interns versus non-eligible. Like it starts to get so granular that you have to pull yourself back up to like that high level number and just explain in the most simple layperson terms as possible.
Yeah. So I feel like it's very easy to get lost in data. So Amy, I was actually writing down your speed versus quality, because that's its own separate thing, and then pipeline versus one role. So if you have, I don't know, let's say like 10 of the same roles you're trying to fill, does that have its own set of data and its own like historical values? And then versus the one role, like let's just say we have a one-off machine learning role and this is all we're doing, and now we're going to go back to that data not last year. Is that how you're separating everything? So there's lots of different points.
Yeah, I think that historic data is really important, and it doesn't have to be exactly the same. So let's use like a G&A function as an example. So let's say you're going to hire like an FP&A analyst or something like that, and you've hired that before, but it's not a pipeline role. You're going to have maybe one or two you're going to hire for the year, for the quarter, and maybe hire a couple other later. you can still pull historic data on the hire that you did last year around that specific industry and use that as a benchmark, which is different than when you're looking at pipeline hires, because that data is going to be much more robust. And so you're going to be able to pull a lot more from that. But the reason it's important to look at historics, regardless of pipeline or one-off role, is because when my team goes into a sync with a hiring partner, I want them armed with that data so that they can be true subject matter experts in the space, so that they can speak to the business and say, hey, historically, to get to XYZ number of hires, 1 hire, 5 hires, 10 hires, whatever it is, it's going to take us X amount of work to get there. Because I think what is often lost, and to nobody's fault, people that don't work in recruiting don't understand the work that goes into recruiting. And so I think educating the business at the very front end, that intake session, letting them know, hey, historically, this is what we're seeing. And typically conversion rate from, last round of interview to offer is X, Y, and Z. I think that's really important, because what that's going to do is it's going to set the tone for you. So if your metrics aren't matching up to that through the course of the search, the recruiter already has that in, so to speak, to bring it back up, because they brought it up on the very first session. They said, this is what you can expect. And so if those numbers aren't looking right, the recruiters can hold the business accountable, and quite frankly, vice versa, around, what that's looking like and why. And so I think it creates this accountability on both sides to be able to kind of move in the right direction and solve any sort of issues or roadblocks that might be popping up.
I love the what to expects. I mean, I'm not going to go on a tangent on candidate experience, but that's immediately what I think of. Like, what to expects have to go every single part of our job, on the hiring manager, on the, on the candidates. Like, we always, on our team, we always have to know like the what to expects. And so like we feel comfortable, taken care of, and we're not like, shooting in the dark here. I absolutely love that. Brittany, anything else to add there?
Yeah, for those like one-of-one roles, or like the brand new roles that you end up recruiting for, where it's not going to be high volume, I found that in addition to Amy's point of like setting the expectation, and even like we've set the expectation of, we've never done this as a company, and this is even like a unique role in the world. Like if we're especially looking at like very niche language education experts, like it's gonna be really unique. So it's really setting the stage with the hiring manager of like, I will keep you more informed than I would for a normal pipeline. That's sort of how our recruiters operate. If it's that one-of-one and you're both going into this uncharted territory together, it's like, here's generally what we would expect for, pass-through rate, but we don't know. We've never done this. So I just find it's a lot more micro updates and just like near constant communication with hiring managers whenever it comes to those like niche one-of-one roles versus roles you have like a ton of historical data for.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Brianna.
No, go.
I was just gonna say, recruiters are on the ground, so they're seeing what's happening. So like, trends that they're seeing in the market are really important to report back on. Are we seeing high response rates on outbound outreach? Are we seeing low response rates? Are we seeing people drop off because of comp or because of timeline, or, there's all sorts of reasons that could be. And your recruiters are uniquely positioned to gather all of that data and be able to summarize it and say, here's the trends that I'm seeing. Here's how we can utilize that to be successful moving forward.
That is a perfect segue. It's like, Amy, you're in like my brain or something. So I was thinking about inbound versus outbound. We've definitely seen a lot of trends, right? So that's why, like how I use Covey Scout was specifically for outbound, and now everyone's using it for inbound because it's really like the same, kind of thing, right? So are you looking at also inbound versus outbound per team, per role, like what's working, and then versus what's my marketing, like my branding, recruiting and whatnot? Are we looking at those two things as a unit or separately?
Yeah, I can jump in. I really believe not in the idea of like, if you post it, they will come. I think, you're going to get lots of applications, of course, and it's really important for us to go through all of those applications. And simultaneously, I think there are certain spaces where there's a need to have that outbound happening in tandem with the inbound. I would say in terms of like data points with inbound versus outbound, there's a couple of things to keep in mind for inbound. Number one, how long are people sitting in your ATS? That doesn't create a great candidate experience. We want to be really mindful of that. Secondarily, if we've got referrals, we've got people that are coming in from our internal, folks that work at the company. How are we treating those folks? What's our SLAs around, getting back to those folks? So I think that that's really important. And then also looking at the sheer volume that we're seeing. So if we're posting something and we're seeing like not a ton of people that are applying, why might that be? Is there an issue with the job description? Is the titling off and not consistent with industry titling? There's a lot of things that you can kind of pick apart there. From an outbound perspective, we really want to be strategic with our outbound outreach, and we want to look at things like interest rate, reply rates, and ultimately that's going to lead to recruiter conversations, hopefully, and then that's going to lead to the next progression of how we look at data.
Nice.
I was just say for us, especially in the university world, it is very outbound heavy. I mean, we get a ton of inbound each year. We are like topping ourselves in terms of number of applications, but for us, we really focus on outbound, and it's like really programmatic. So we do a lot of events-based recruiting. We've shifted away from doing career fairs, but we're doing things that are meeting students where they are, especially because we're based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We're not in a major tech hub. So we have to meet students where they are. But we also have a very high focus. I know a lot of orgs do at this point, but like for the past several years, we've really been focused on increasing representation of women, Black, and Hispanic Latino candidates. And so for us, we know that we can't just sort of rest on our laurels and wait for, students and people to apply to us. Again, we need to meet people where they are. So specific organizations, specific partnerships, hosting events in specific cities at specific conferences. And so then we track all of that, right? Who we're reaching out to from those orgs, percentage of people who reply from those orgs. Then it's like the whole trickle down, right? Of like attending events, responding to emails, like we use a CRM, things like that. But for us on the university side, it is hyper focused on the outbound and the results that we get from specific pockets and events that we host.
The actual hunting, the intention, I feel like it's intentional recruiting. I love that. So back to the metrics, and let's help every recruiter out here. And I think at any level you are, this is going to help. But what metrics should recruiters themselves pay attention to? How does that measure their success? Because I feel like every org and every team is a little different there. And then additionally, are we giving recruiters a bonus for hitting certain metrics? Like what's more important? Brittany, let's start with you.
Yeah. So for my team in particular, we really look at, the end number, right? Like, are we hitting the hiring goal? That's the biggest one. And are we hitting it in the appropriate amount of time to fill? That's going to depend on your role type. And then we are looking at pass-through rate. We'll see if there's specific parts of your process where it's not aligning to either what we want, whether that's the company average, your role type average, things like that. But like we're looking at pass-through rate. And again, thinking about the representation piece, we're looking at pass-through rate as it pertains to specific demographic breakdowns. We use an internal tool right now that can break down pass-through rate by race and gender and ethnicity and the cross-section of those two. So it's like, are we losing specific populations? What do we need to change? Do we need to add in additional resources for these candidates? Do we need to bulk up the top part of our pipeline? Are we losing people at the bottom? So like pass-through rate for us at each stage, so important for us to look at, because that indicates while we're in the season, while we're actually recruiting, what do we need to tweak and change while we're going, instead of waiting until the end of, for us, it'd be a whole year that we would lose out on if we waited until the very end with those retros. So pass-through rates for us are perhaps the most important in university.
So everyone's now wondering, what tool is that?
So we use a couple different ones. We have GEM and then we have Ashby. We're looking at another BI business intelligence tool that in partnership with other HR / we call it people team here at Duolingo. We're looking at a new one for this coming year, but right now I even had it in my notes. Like we're sort of figuring out in the past 2 years really which tools I feel like we had none, then we expanded, and now we're back to like, honing down and figuring out.
Yeah, I think that's super common. I mean, I know it's really crowded. I mean, tools are so crowded. AI came in, right? And now it's like, this does this, it's like shiny penny. How can we fix things? There's so many things to fix, but yeah, really taking a step back and looking at tools. Actually, Amy, you had said it. We talked last week talking about what your team does for tools. Let's tell everyone what you said.
Yeah, for sure. So my team, actually, I do a weekly meeting with my team. It's our general meeting, and we do all sorts of different things to kind of work through different skill set growths. And one of the things we're doing right now is actually a recruiting tools presentation. Mm-hmm. So everybody on my team can actually choose a recruiting tool that they've found, and they basically kind of break it down and they explain what's the tool, what does it do? What's the use case? And then is this something that our team would benefit from? And it doesn't mean that we're going to go out and get that tool, but it helps us really stay current on what's happening in the industry. And also have really interesting dialogue and conversations around things like AI, around, all sorts of things that might be happening, and how, again, we can stay current on those. My goal as a leader is always to make sure that my team is set up for success, and really continuing to evolve in their careers. And so making sure that they have that knowledge and they can speak to those things is really important for me as a leader. So it's been really interesting. We've had a lot of interesting discussions, and definitely seen some cool products that I didn't even know about that my team's brought to the table.
I love that. I call that learning rainbows over here, and we pick something to like teach everyone. It also gives, them practice on presentation skills, which I think it helps with hiring managers as well.
Really important.
Okay. So I didn't want to steal the metric conversation, because I'm dying to know what metrics you would say as a recruiter should hold strong in their hearts.
Yeah, so I totally agree around the conversion piece. We need to be really mindful. I think I mentioned this before, around what those conversions look like, because those actually tell a much stronger narrative than even the time to fill. Because as an example, if you're seeing a big disconnect between candidates moving from hiring manager screen to like round 1 or round 2 of an interview, there might be an issue. Maybe we need to recalibrate on what that profile looks like, and that's going to potentially increase our time to fill. So while time to fill is really important, I think time to fill is very dependent on the difficulty of the role, the level of the role. There's a lot of variables, I think, that are causing that number to be not consistent across the board. Whereas what is consistent is how many people should we typically have to interview before we get to a hire. That should be a pretty consistent number for your company, especially for like a specific part of the business. And so getting to those numbers, I think is really, really crucial. And you mentioned something, and I think it's important to address this. Our team is not incentivized by hires. And I think that's important to call out, because we're not in the business of pushing candidates to be in positions that they're not suited for, or that they're not a fit for, or that don't elevate our bar of talent as a company. So our team is incentivized from a goaling perspective of, similarly, like, what's that team goal? How are we working through that? And our team is certainly not bonused or looked at by those individual metrics, which I think is an important thing to call out, because I think sometimes there are some misconceptions on recruiters or how recruiters are operating. And so I always like to kind of be the spokesperson for the recruiter and say, hey, that's not what we're in the business of doing.
Mm-hmm. I love that you call that out, because like Brittany was saying, yes, at the end of the day, we have to get our hires. We also have to get the right hires, because a wrong hire, so this is what I want to bring in the data here, how much a wrong hire, I don't want to say bad hire, a wrong hire costs the company. Is that something you both track? I know it's a hard one.
We do not currently. I mean, and again, like, wrong hire meaning just wrong fit, right? Like,
not a good fit. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, every person has those companies that are going to be the right fit, and then not the right fit. So we are not tracking that currently, right? Like, hire. I'm assuming your question is like hire, and then like hire didn't work out. Let's like look retroactively at why.
Yeah. I think a lot of people will leave in the first 90 days typically, and then like how much that then cost us. Like, do we look back at all of those things? Yeah.
We haven't tracked that yet. No, we're still, while we were post IPO, we were still, it feels like an adolescent company for us.
Definitely. I think for us, it's more like looking at regretful versus not regretful attrition. And if we're seeing, regretful attrition in higher rates in a specific team or department, That's something that we need to look at. Why is that happening? Did we not have an understanding of what this team really was doing or what the structure of this team was? There's different things to look at. And again, this is where you can leverage your ride or die, your people partner here, to really kind of work with you on uncovering that. Because it isn't just the job of recruiting to figure those things out. And it also isn't just the job of recruiting to hire the right talent into the right roles. That's why candidates go through an interview process. It isn't just a one person makes the decision. They're going through and we're trying to get signal on all of these different areas. And hopefully we've done that correctly. If we're seeing a lot of mistakes, we'll call it, or things that are kind of slipping through the cracks, there might be a case to say, hey, we need to relook at this process. What are areas that we're not getting signal on that we may need to get signal on? So was it a leadership issue? Did this person not have the leadership skills? And do we need to relook at our leadership behavior questions? Or do we need to, how are we kind of thinking through that? And so I think looking at regretful versus non-regretful attrition numbers tells a really interesting narrative.
I love how you put that. I have never heard that. Brittany, have you heard it put that way? Regretful. I like it. Such a nice way to put it. Okay, so going to that, like here we are looking at all these different data insights. And at the end of the day, I feel like we have to help, obviously our internal team, but back to the candidate experience, like we want to use the data to do better with our candidates in order to then bring in those right hires. So how do you do that? Because we can't make everybody happy, but we want to use the data to show, well, no, the data shows we need to do this. So how do we do that with candidate experience? I think it's ambiguous.
Yeah, we have inconsistently used like candidate surveys. I mean, those are going to get you only so far, right? Like you're usually going to get either end of the bell curve of like really pleased or really displeased candidates. We used to look at like Glassdoor reviews. And we started to thankfully get away from that. For us, honestly, like we do, not to pat ourselves on the back, but we do consistently get pretty good feedback about the candidate experience from the candidates themselves, even candidates who don't end up getting an offer from us. So a lot of it's going to be qualitative versus quantitative that we look at. And even things like relationships that we'll build with candidates and then we don't end up offering them or they don't make it through the full process. And then we'll be like, hey, what else can we like do to help? They're often quite forthcoming. Of course, it takes asking and it's going to take more effort and you're not going to have that large scale data, right? It's going to be smaller data points. So we'll do that directly from the candidates themselves. And then going back to partnerships I'd sort of mentioned before, there are some organizations we're a part of that have a ton of data from like tens of thousands of students, and they'll have their own surveys, and it won't be necessarily people in our pipeline, but it will be the profiles of people that we're looking for. And it'll be like, hey, this is what was important to me in the interview process. Here's what I'm looking for in my next role. Here's why I reneged on an offer, because that's what's happening a lot in the university space right now is like average renege rate, which means accepting an offer and then not starting, is about 10% right now. So that's quite high, I would say. And for us, like that's just the new norm, right? So how can we combat things, or how can we just build that into what we're predicting with our data of how many hires or how many offers we need to make each year? So the like word of mouth and that like very like qualitative data that we'll get, but then the quantitative data we'll get from partner organizations who have direct access to a high volume of potential candidates.
I think that's a really great thing to touch on. And I want to ask everyone, I know we're almost getting to time here, but ask everyone here, who tracks why do people not accept an offer? Are we tracking like those common denominators? Yeah. So Amy, how are you tracking that? Is it through your ATS? Is it like, okay.
It's through our ATS. It's important because then we can start to see like, do we have issues with comp? Do we have issues with our hybrid policy? Do we have issues with whatever it might be? We can start to kind of assess what those might be and start to kind of figure out where the disconnect is. And candidate experience to us is crucial because regardless if we hire the person or not, people think about like Yelp reviews. What do you see Yelp reviews? It's people that are angry, and same thing with Glassdoor. Oftentimes, like people are going to go and say their opinions, which is totally fine. They should. But at the end of the day, how we can kind of get ahead of that is really being upfront and letting folks know how much time things are going to take, even if it means like, hey, I need another week on this. Like I want to be transparent with you, and if you have other things cooking and you've got other decisions you need to make, like we totally understand, but we're just not there yet. And so I think just being as open and transparent as possible, that's what we always try to preach for my team, is just making sure that they're giving candidates enough information so candidates can make educated decisions too.
Yes. And we should always know why someone didn't accept the role, right? Like, yeah. I mean, recruiters, please always know why. There's not like, I think this person didn't accept for this reason. It's like, we know they didn't accept for this reason, I think
and you should know that going in too, because you should have had a pre-close conversation and know like what their flags were potentially before you even got to that close. So that way, when that answer comes in, of course, there's always one-off weird things that happen. Sure. But for the most part, you should be like, I knew comp was going to be an issue. I knew that, they had a competing offer with this, or I knew our timing was off, or whatever, our location was an issue, whatever it is. Like you should kind of know that going into the conversation, and there should be few surprises, hopefully.
Yes. I always tell my team, I always say, if you're ever surprised by someone not accepting, then there was something wrong throughout the entire process. Like you didn't have real conversation, because I think humans in general only want to hear what they want to hear, right? We're not truly listening to understand. And I think that's really important. And I know we're at time, and I feel like we could talk about every single data point in the recruiting process for another hour at least. But let's leave everyone with just one thing, one takeaway, regardless of the level, when it comes to data-driven recruiting. Brittany, let's start with you.
I'm just going to go into ask why. Ask why at least twice.
I
love it. That's a life lesson right there. Amy, what do you think?
I'd say just tell the story. Be a data storyteller, and similar to Brittany, don't be afraid to ask questions and allow folks to kind of get to their own answers via those questions.
Yeah, I know people get scared to ask questions. Like think about when you're in school and you're like, I don't want to be the one raising my hand, but the one that raises their hand, that's the one that gets the answers and does their job. We don't want to let anyone affect our ability to do our job. So thank you, Amy, Brittany. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for listening. Covey, thank you so much for putting these on every single month. We'll see you next month.